Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to break down complex ideas into something useful for you.
That's right.
And today, wow, we're getting into some really, really foundational questions. We're talking belief and non-belief.
Core stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Our source is belief and non-belief, a foundational debate. And we're really focusing on part one, the opening arguments, why each side sort of lands where they do.
Right. And the goal here isn't really about agreement, It's more about understanding the different ways people start to make sense of, well, everything.
Different lenses, you could say.
Exactly. Different lenses. And what's fascinating in this first part is how it lays out those initial premises, the absolute starting points.
Like where we come from.
Yeah, where we come from, how the universe works, even, why we think some things are right and others are wrong. It tackles those big questions right at the outset.
Okay, so let's dig into that. The source, it tells us that for believers, a really central argument, kind of a foundation, is that classic design argument.
Ah, yes, the design argument.
They look at the universe, right? All the order, the precision, the way physical laws seem so perfectly balanced.
Finely tuned.
Finely tuned, exactly. And for them, it doesn't just hint at a creator. It strongly points to one. It feels intentional.
Yeah, the source really emphasizes that sense of intentionality. It mentions things like the Big Bang. For believers, that's often seen not just as physics, but as a moment of divine creation.
Like the universe being spoken into existence.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah.
And then there's the complexity of life itself, from a single cell all the way up to us.
The source calls it God's fingerprint, I think.
It does use that phrase. It frames it as seeing this complexity as, well, pretty clear evidence of a divine architect at work.
And this perspective, it leads to a really crucial point this source brings up. What happens to meaning, to morality, if you don't have that belief?
Right. That's a major concern highlighted in the text for the belief side. They feel that without a higher power, things like purpose and, crucially, morality become unmoored.
Adrift, yeah. And they pose that really direct question, don't they? If there's no God, where does right and wrong actually come from?
Exactly. It's presented as this fundamental challenge. The source frames it almost as an argument for the necessity of God for ethics to even exist.
Okay, so that's one starting point. What about the other side, the non-belief perspective? How does the source show their opening arguments?
Well, it's fundamentally different, as you'd expect. Their opening shot, according to the source, is often quite direct. We don't actually need God to explain things.
Okay, bold statement. So how does the source say they back that up? What's their alternative explanation for, well, life and the universe?
Science. It really boils down to science as the primary or maybe only reliable explanatory tool.
So for life's complexity?
Evolution, natural selection. The source highlights this as the comprehensive answer, showing how complexity arises naturally over time, no need for supernatural input.
And the cosmos, the Big Bang, galaxies.
Physics takes care of that. Natural laws, observable phenomena. They argue that scientific investigation, because it's based on evidence you can test, is the only real path to understanding how things actually work.
Right. But what about that morality question? The one believers pose. If it doesn't come from God, where does it come from for non-believers?
Okay, yeah, the source gets into this. It talks about morality being seen as an evolved social instinct.
Evolved? How so?
Well, the idea presented is that things like empathy, cooperation, fairness, these weren't handed down from on high. They're behaviors that helped early human groups survive and thrive.
So they got selected for, naturally.
Pretty much. Traits that promoted group sticking togetherness and survival tended to get passed on. It's a very earthbound explanation, pragmatic.
And the source mentions a key distinction they made too, right? Something about knowledge versus comfort.
Yes, absolutely crucial. The quote highlighted is something like, belief without evidence isn't knowledge, it's comfort. That's a core premise for them.
Implying that real understanding needs proof, not just faith.
Exactly. Empirical verification is key.
Wow. So, okay, we've just unpacked two really different starting points here based on part one of this source.
Yeah.
You've got the belief side, seeing order and complexity as pointing strongly towards intention.
Right. The Big Bang as creation, life as a fingerprint.
And feeling that without God, meaning and morality just sort of crumble, leading to that big question. Where does good and bad come from then?
And then you have the non-belief side, holding that science actually gives us the answers we need. Evolution for life, physics for the universe.
And seeing morality as something that grew out of our social evolution.
Precisely, an evolved social instinct. And making that strong point, Belief without evidence offers comfort, maybe, but not genuine knowledge.
It really highlights how fundamental these starting points are, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. They shape everything that follows, which kind of leads to a question for you listening. Thinking about these two foundational approaches, how do they resonate with, though? Or maybe challenge how you approach making sense of the world?
Definitely something to chew on as you encounter new ideas and information.
Today, we're really plunging into some of humanity's biggest questions, aren't we? We're talking about consciousness, suffering, even the idea of the soul itself. And our deep dive today is pulling from this really fascinating dialogue you shared, where you see these different perspectives just grappling with these fundamental things. So our mission really is to unpack these complex ideas for you. We want to lay out the challenging questions, sure, but also the counter-arguments, help you navigate this deep intellectual stuff without feeling totally lost.
Yeah, and let's just dive right in with maybe the biggest one from the source material. How do you explain consciousness? The self, the soul. The dialogue really highlights this challenge from believers. They argue that neuroscience, it maps the brain brilliantly, but it hasn't really explained who's watching inside.
Right, the subjective feeling, the me.
Exactly. If the brain's just a super complex machine, where does that feeling that I actually live? And the sources bring up things like near-death experiences or those really profound spiritual awakenings people report. They see these as, pretty compelling evidence that there's maybe more to us than just biology.
Something non-physical.
Kind of, yeah. Maybe some irreducible part that science just hasn't grasped yet.
That definitely pushes the boundaries of how we think about ourselves. But, the conversation in your sources, it doesn't just leave it there, right? How do the other viewpoints push back against this idea, this sort of separate soul?
Oh, absolutely. The atheists in this dialogue, they come back pretty sharp. Their line is basically, extraordinary claims need extraordinary evidence. Simple as that. From their angle, consciousness is, most likely an emergent property. Emergent
property. Like how wetness isn't in one water molecule, but appears when you have lots of them.
Precisely. Or think of a symphony. No single note is the whole piece, but put them all together, and you get something much bigger, much more complex. The sources suggest consciousness could be like that, a really sophisticated output, something that arises from the brain's incredible complexity, its neural networks firing together.
So not something separate inhabiting the brain, but a product of the brain.
Exactly. It's a completely different way to look at it, one that's really grounded in the physical world we can observe.
Okay, so that's consciousness. But then the sources shift, moving from sort of the nature of the self to this huge issue of suffering, another really profound, really difficult topic. And the atheists in this dialogue, they pose that age-old, really poignant question that if God is good, why is the world so cruel? I mean, they point to wars, disease, injustice. It's all laid out pretty starkly in the sources. And they argue, when you see that much suffering, it makes believing in some kind of benevolent divine plan, it makes it really hard.
It's a powerful challenge, no doubt. It's something people have wrestled with for millennia, and it hits close to home for everyone.
It really does. But the believers in the dialogue, they have a response, a counter-argument.
They do. They propose that, look, suffering exists in a broken world, not because of God, but because of free will. So the idea often connects to humans having genuine autonomy, genuine choice. And the suffering we experience is, in this view, a consequence of choices made in a world that's, fallen short of how it was meant to be.
So it's not God causing it, but allowing it as a result of freedom.
That's the core idea.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting is that for them, pain isn't just meaningless noise. The sources suggest it can actually serve a purpose for human growth, maybe even redemption.
Growth. Redemption, how does that work?
Well, the thinking is that navigating hardship can forge resilience. It can build compassion, maybe lead someone to a deeper spiritual connection. It's less about fixing external problems and more about sort of inner transformation, redeeming something broken within us through the experience.
Wow. That is a really stark contrast, isn't it? Between those two perspectives on suffering, what we're seeing here is this incredible tension between these views on consciousness, on suffering. These are definitely not simple questions, no easy answers here. And the sources really show the depth, the nuance on all sides.
Absolutely. It's mind-boggling, really, thinking about how our self could just emerge from neurons firing.
Or how immense suffering could somehow have a purpose. The implications are just huge. for how we see ourselves, our place in the universe.
All right. And what's fascinating is how these different takes on human experience, how we define ourselves, why we suffer, they really challenge your own understanding, your own view of the world, this problem of evil, the mystery of consciousness. They aren't just philosophical games. The sources show they echo in every life, in joy and loss, in that basic search for meaning we all have.
So as you listening, think about these arguments.
Yeah, maybe just consider which of these questions really resonates with you and why. What feels most challenging or maybe most comforting in these different ways of looking at things? Something to definitely ponder.
One of humanity's oldest quests, maybe, the search for truth.
That's right.
And our source today, especially some parts from the human pursuit of truth, faith, logic, and openness, well, it pushes us beyond the usual divides.
Yeah, it talks about this thing called the middle ground.
Exactly.
A middle ground. And just to be clear, this deep dive isn't really about, saying one way is the way.
No.
It's more about shedding light on how, really different ways of looking at the universe might actually overlap, surprisingly.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to unpack the atheist view, the believer view, like the source lays them out.
And then see where they might meet.
Precisely. Where's that convergence point? It's quite insightful.
Okay, so what jumped out at me right away from the material is how it kind of flips assumptions. It looks at the atheist perspective first.
Yeah.
Based on logic, evidence.
Like the empirical stuff.
Yeah. But it points out this surprising admission you often find. It actually quotes something like, "We don't have all the answers. The universe is strange."
That's interesting.
Yeah, consciousness is mysterious.
Yeah.
It suggests atheists often go for honest uncertainty over blind faith.
Okay. Honest uncertainty.
Right. And sometimes that leans towards agnosticism, that feeling of, maybe there's something, but we just can't pin it down.
And that admission, that uncertainty, it is fascinating, isn't it?
It is.
It shows a kind of humility when faced with just everything, existence.
Yeah.
It's not just saying, I don't know. It's acknowledging how vast the unknown really is.
So is it just a blank space then? For some?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? Or does that mystery maybe, hint at more?
And that's right where the believer's perspective, according to the source, comes in.
Okay.
They look at that exact same deep mystery.
The same unknown.
And often say, that mystery, that's God. Or maybe divine.
Oh, okay.
Whether it's in the feeling of love or consciousness itself or just that gut feeling that,
Something bigger exists.
Yeah. That feeling, to them, that points to the divine.
Right.
And the source makes a point that a lot of these people aren't strictly, dogmatically religious.
Not necessarily tied to institutions.
Exactly. They feel deeply connected. Spiritual, maybe, but not organized religion.
So what's really insightful there, I think, is how both groups, they're wrestling with the same massive questions.
Existence means.
Yeah, the fundamental stuff. One side uses, observation, logic, embracing that honest uncertainty. The other uses intuition, awe, maybe a sense of transcendence.
And finds connection in the mystery.
Exactly. Finds connection within that exact same mystery. It's like they're looking at the same incredible reality, just through different lenses.
Okay, so the source talks about this middle ground. It's not just saying, let's all be nice.
No.
It seems more active than that. What does that space actually look like? How does it define it?
Well, it frames it less as intellectual compromise.
Right, not just meeting halfway on beliefs.
No, more like a space of shared experience.
Yeah.
That deep humility in the atheist's honest uncertainty. It actually resonates, the source suggests, with the believer's sense of awe.
Okay. That makes sense.
Both sides recognize this profound mystery. They just use different words, different approaches.
Different labels.
Yeah. The key insight is that the act of grappling, the human response to the unknown, that's what unites them.
So that's the common ground, the shared quest.
It offers a shared starting point.
Yeah.
For exploration, not just arguing. The source puts it nicely. Something like, the universe whispers its secrets to both the logician and the mystic.
Just in different tongues. Yeah, I remember that line. That's good.
It really captures it.
So ultimately, what this source pushes us towards is seeing that, different starting point.
Totally different.
But maybe everyone's chasing the same thing, understanding, trying to make sense of this, this existence we're all in.
Right. Whether it's through logic or faith, it's about understanding the same universe.
That's the core takeaway then.
I think so. And the source suggests the real answer maybe isn't about choosing a side, but in staying open. That's the phrase it uses, staying open.
Okay.
So here's a final thought, something for you to mull over. If the deepest understanding comes from embracing this middle ground, what might we actually discover about the universe, about ourselves? What happens if we let that honest uncertainty sit alongside that feeling of profound connection? If we value both logic and that intuitive knowing, what opens up then? Something to think about.